Appreciate your presence tonight. Thankful again for this time together. We are discussing this week, or plan to discuss this week, subjects that I think are basic, fundamental, subjects that I hope will provoke thought, especially in those who may be accessing this teaching who are not members of the Church of Christ, who are not regular to our number. I hope it won't be a waste of time for anybody. But I do believe it is important that we try to present to the world the message of God, so very different from the message that the world has bought into and believed without question. And certainly the book of Ecclesiastes, I think, fits in that category because it speaks so eloquently, so plainly to a fundamental point. You know, Ecclesiastes, I'm still not sure how a book in the Old Testament got a Greek title, probably borrowed from the Vulgate or something like that, but I don't know why they insisted on continuing it. But it's a great word, and though we don't know much about Greek, we certainly, through the years, we've heard lessons about ecclesia, haven't we? If you put your finger over the last four letters of Ecclesiastes, you get ecclesia. We remember that's the word translated in our English Bible most of the time, church, called out. And so ecclesia, or Ecclesiastes, I should say, is the one who does the calling. It's, in the Hebrew, they tell me, koheleth. It is in our English Bible translated in most cases here, the preacher. And so here is a wise man who calls us to come and sit at his feet and to talk to us about life. And as we said this morning, what he wants to tell us in the first place is that if all you see is life under the sun, then I'll tell you what the profit in life is. It's zero. It's just vanity. And nothing matters. And you can try to fill that void by indulging in the prideful worldly wisdom and tell yourself how smart human beings are. We can figure all the questions out without God. And in the end, you're going to find out that you don't know the answers. Or you can just wallow in hedonism. But that'll distract you for a while, but it won't really fill the void. It won't really satisfy. It will not really bring you peace in your heart. You can indulge in materialism and you can chase things, but if you gain as many things as Solomon had, what in the end you're going to find out is that they don't really bring you joy. They bring you a lot of worry. And they're useful in some ways, but in the end, if that's what your life is built on, then pretty soon, if you're a thinking person, you begin to realize how you're going to leave it all behind. And Solomon said, I hated life. We talked about all that this morning. And we pointed out how, like one fellow called Ecclesiastes, he said it's a study of how to stay off dead-end streets. And I think that's partially true. And I think there's a point to be made. And we tried to make it this morning, reminding people who've read Ecclesiastes many times. That Solomon would say to us, this wise man, this Ecclesiastes would say to us, look, human beings have not changed a whit. They got the same problems. They check the same old dead-end roads for solutions. I've been down all these roads. I can tell you they're all dead ends. You can waste your life chasing that too, but if you're smart, if you're wise, you'll listen to me, and you'll not waste your life in these areas. And we said this morning with our young people, who have had a lot of advantages, and they've grown up in places like this and hearing good Bible teaching. And I tell you, it won't be a few years. And I see these young folks in this crowd right here, and I'm talking about in just an amazingly few years. They're going to be off on their own, making their own decisions. And I tell you what they're going to do when that time comes. They're going to do what they believe to be true. And I'm saying to you, if you will listen to God, you will save yourself a lot of scars and a lot of heartache and a lot of regrets. Be wise. Well, but Ecclesiastes is not just don't do this and don't do this and this is a bad thing. It also commends to us the right way, the better way. And that's what I want to spend our time with on tonight, if I might. And I'm going to start in the most obvious place because we all know Ecclesiastes 12. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man, the old King James says, the whole of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be bad. And I'll tell you what he says to us here. He says, you've got to be willing in the first place. If you're going to find any sense in life, any perspective in life, you have to start by giving God His place. And it's just amazing we live in a world that is not willing to do that. I mean, it seems to me, I had an old professor and he was a believer. And I remember him telling us as we were students, he said, the most illogical, irrational, philosophical position a man can hold is to say there is no God. That just makes no sense. That the creation would say there's no creator. This is insane. How the Hebrew writer put it, Hebrews 3 and verse 4, every house is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God. It is just as obvious that the universe has a creator as it is to say that some house out here on the street had a builder. Or as the old argument used to go, that a watch has a watchmaker. I've never seen the fellow that made my watch. Never even seen a picture of him. Don't know who it is. But I can guarantee you somebody made my watch. I know that because watches just don't pop out of nowhere. I used the illustration before, and many have used it. Smarter fellows than me have used this point. But I think it's still a good one. I've got an old mantle clock that I bought several years ago on a trip overseas, and it's not terribly expensive, but we sort of like it. Now it needs to be fixed. But when it's running, it has a pretty Westminster chime, and anyway, it's a little wooden case, a little glass face on it. And if you ask me, where did that come from? Who made it? And I were to say, well, I don't believe in watchmakers. I've never seen a clockmaker myself. But my best guess I have a theory about where this thing came from. I believe that somewhere, maybe around here, millions and millions of years ago, there was an explosion out in the woods somewhere, a great explosion. And then the heat that came from that explosion, there's sand in the ground and glass began to form and the wood splintered and pieces began to fly and metal in the ground. And I think this great explosion created these pieces, and over millions of years, they just sort of came together. And that's where this clock came from. And you'd say, well, man, you need to take an aspirin. You need to lay down. There's something wrong with you. But if I tell you that's how the universe came about, out of an explosion, an accident. And please don't ask me where all the things that exploded came from, because I don't have an answer to that. Science. That's not even good nonsense. And yet this is what smart folks believe. And they are smart folks, but that's not smart. I tell you, I'm not an intellectual and I'm not a scholar. But if you're asking me to jump on this train that says there is no God, somebody's going to have to explain to me where matter came from. And hey, by the way, where life came from. Matter coming from nothing and life coming from non-life is not science. And it doesn't make sense. And so those are just the simple arguments. I may not, listen, a fellow may come in here and he's been teaching biology for 30 years and he may have all kinds of questions I don't know the answer to. But he ain't got an answer for that. And until he does, then that's really as far as I need to go. And I wonder why it is that people, smart people, hold to this view so tightly. We mentioned Richard Dawkins. We mention him one more time before we quit tonight. He's a celebrity atheist, and he's a very bright fellow. He's a biologist over somewhere. He used to be over at Oxford or somewhere. He wrote a book several years ago, and he called it The Blind Watchmaker. And if you have read that book, what it is it's Dawkins trying to explain to us how I know it looks like somebody made the world and made the universe, but really they didn't. It's a blind watchmaker. You see. It's all blind process. And again, I'm not as smart as Dawkins, but I thought you mislabeled that book. What you should have called it was The Watch That Made Itself. That's what you should have called it. Not the blind watch. There's no watchmaker. You should have called it The Watch That Made Itself. Why would a smart fellow like that take such a foolish view? Well, I don't know specifically about him, and I can't answer for specific individuals. But I do know that there are an awful lot of people who reject God because they don't like this second part. Because if there is a God, as surely as God made us, He did not make us to no purpose. That if there is a Creator, that He surely has spoken to us and has expectations for us. And that's right. Over in Acts the 17th chapter, there's a great sermon. Sometimes you wonder, maybe you've been in this situation multiple times, if you're called on spontaneously to teach in some environments, you haven't had a chance to prepare, and you get a chance to talk to unbelievers. What in the world would you say if that happened to you tonight or tomorrow? Well, here's some advice that I think we can agree on. I think Paul's sermon in Acts 17 is a pretty good place to start. Because Paul got a chance to speak before the Areopagus there, a group of these intellectuals, and none of them were believers in Christ. And he had looked around and seen the idolatry of the city, and he said, let me tell you, fellows, about the true God, the God whom you've missed, the God whom you've tried to cover by this altar to the unknown God. He's the God that made the world and all things that are therein. He's Lord of heaven and earth, and He doesn't dwell in a temple. You can't contain Him in a box. He doesn't need anything. He gives to all life and breath and all things. He's made of one blood, verse 26, all nations of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and He has determined the times before appointed, the bounds of their habitation. Notice, verse 27, that they should seek the Lord. Why did God make man? That we should seek the Lord. If haply they may feel after Him and find Him, though He be not far from every one of us, for in Him we live and move and have our very being. Even your own poets have said we are His offspring. Now, Paul said, God made us, but He made us for a purpose, and that is to seek Him and to serve Him. You want to know why it is that I think so many of these folks reject God and why atheism is so popular in so many quarters? I think people, it's just this simple. There are people who do not want anybody, even God Almighty, telling them what to do. Now, let me say, a fellow who's going to try to get through life without having a boss is going to have a hard time. But people have decided they don't want God being their boss. So we just act like He doesn't exist. That's a good plan. I'm sure that'll work out well for you. But that's where we are. The wise man would say to us, if you want to find a better life, the first step is to give God His place. And the second step is then to listen to what He has to say. And to recognize in the third place that the God who made us and who has expectation for us and has given us His word and told us what He expects of us is the same God one day who's going to judge us. While we're in Acts 17, just continue reading. Paul makes that very point. The times of this ignorance, God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent. Verse 31, because He hath appointed a day in which He will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom He hath ordained, whereof He hath given assurance, in that He hath raised Him from the dead. Just as surely as Christ was raised from the dead, you can count on this. One day there's going to be a reckoning from all men. That includes you, it includes me. It includes every self-proclaimed atheist. One day we're going to give account for the things that we do. And that's, I think, the reason why smart people, in so many cases, I can't judge every person, but I think in so many cases why smart people turn away from the obvious fact that creation was created. Somebody said these folks rail against the virgin birth. They got a virgin birth of the whole universe. They believe it just came from, they don't know where it came from. I saw a quote. This came from a television interview that a fellow named Julian Huxley, who was a famous biologist, in the early 70s. It was news when a famous person got on television, was bold enough to talk about they didn't believe in God. Back then, that was something rare. And he was quoted on this show as saying, the reason we accepted Darwinism, even without proof, is because we did not want God to interfere with our sexual mores. That's pretty raw, isn't it? He's just saying, we didn't want God to tell us who we could sleep with and we couldn't sleep with, therefore we just pushed God out of the way. We want to live our life and follow our lust. Lee Strobel, maybe a name that some of you know, he's since become a believer and written several books on apologetics. He talks about his former life. In one interview, he said, I was more than happy to latch on to Darwinism as an excuse to jettison the idea of God so I could unabashedly pursue my own agenda in life without moral constraints. I just get rid of my guilt that way. Just get rid of God. There's a better way to get rid of your guilt. It's called repentance. But for some people, that's the way to get rid of guilt. Just throw it all out, throw all the rules out the window. Nobody's a lawbreaker. Oh, my. If Darwinism is true, if there's no God, we all just came from the green, slimy algae, then I can sleep with whomever I want to. In Darwinism, there's no moral accountability. I think there's a lot of truth in that statement. If that's the case, if that's what you're looking for, is just to be free from guilt and accountability, then here's a mode that provides it. But what a terrible cost comes with that. What the wise man will tell us is that we're human beings and we're made for something better. But I want to look at chapter 3 and verse 18 and make a quick point about this, if I might, because I think this is really relevant, especially in our time and in our country. That's where Solomon wrote, I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts, even one thing befalleth them. As one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they all have one breath. A man has no preeminence above a beast. All is vanity. All go to the same place. All are of dust. All turn to dust again. Who knows the spirit of man that goeth downward, and the spirit of the beast spirit of man that goes upward, the spirit of the beast that goes downward? I've heard people wrestle with this passage, but I think that the real meaning of this passage is taken in the context that what Solomon is doing here is he's speaking to the ungodly man, to the man who sees just life under the sun. And his prayer is that man might, by God's grace, be shown the fact that choice makes him nothing more than an animal. And that's unthinkable for a human being to lower themselves to the level of an animal. However, that's exactly what our society tells us we are. We were talking about going to Washington this afternoon. My family and I, several years ago, made a trip to Washington and D.C., the capital. We had our agenda. We had a few days there. We had several things we wanted to do. This is an image of I don't know what they call it, but it's the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, whatever the title is. This was not on my agenda. I'll just be honest with you. I had no interest in going in there. It just so happened we had a few minutes extra, and we found ourselves literally right in front of the place. So we went in. I knew what I would find when I got in there, and they didn't disappoint. It was a museum, high-tech, impressive, all showing us all of these artifacts and then interpreting it for us and saying, what this proves is that there is no God. And they hit you hard, and they're not subtle about it. Now, this has been several years ago. By the way, some of these pictures are terrible. I mean, just physically, I'm not very good at taking pictures, and I had a lousy camera. So that together doesn't spell success. So if you can't read it all, don't worry about it. But here it was a display on our ape heritage. Our ape heritage. Which is already insulting. What was it? It was Foy Wallace used to say, Brother Hall, he used to say, he said, some of these Darwinists tell me that I'm wrong, that they don't really claim that we came from monkeys. They say, in fact, that we have a common ancestor. Well, he said that doesn't help my feelings much. If a monkey is either he's my daddy or he's my brother, either way, I don't either. I don't feel very good about that myself. But there's a lot of truth in that point. Notice how they lower and degrade human beings. Adapted for flexibility. Fossils and DNA confirm that humans and primates and members of the great ape family are all, we didn't evolve from the same, but we are all share the same characteristics. We're all a part of the same great ape family. And they have quite a display. Again, this is a poor picture here, but I wanted to give you the shot of the overall display here. You have human beings here in the center, and then little concentric circles here going around, and links to those circles. How are you related to other living things? And so on one side of the chart, it shows that you are 98.8 genetically similar to a chimpanzee. How about that? And you're 93% genetically similar to a rhesus monkey. The implication being, well, obviously, you share a common ancestry. Of course, I thought it was like the old saying goes, what proves too much proves nothing at all. I noticed on the other side of the chart, they had up there, that I'm also 75% genetically similar to a chicken and 60% genetically similar to a banana tree, which I thought was interesting. What does that prove? It could be that we are made of a lot of the same stuff because God made us all. It doesn't mean that one came from the other, that a banana tree evolved into a human being, or that we came from a common banana tree. But you get the flow of this, and there's just a steady stream of this kind of propaganda. This was a particularly insulting chart. Well, look at here. Look how similar we are. And I love you all. I'm just going to go ahead and say this. Maybe I shouldn't say it. I want to tell you, they have to put a blue-eyed kid on the other side of that picture. Because if they didn't, there would sure enough be some problems. Because that would be insulting. Yes, it is. It's insulting to put any child there. But you see what's happened? We've decided that, yeah, that's right. We're just animals. What Solomon said, I pray that God will help these people see when they won't give God His place, we become an animal. Both the animal and the man die. That's back in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. They both have one ruach, one breath. The body of both returns to the dust. And the spirit, who knows? Again, if it's life under the sun, now this is what he's talking about. If all we see is life under the sun, and that's all we consider, then what do you know about what happens to people after they die? Not one thing. All I know, God reveals. And if there is no God, as far as I can tell, we're just like the dog. We're dead and we're gone. And the body goes in the grave and the spirit goes wherever it goes. And Solomon said, surely a human being would not be willing to be degraded in that way. And our society says, think again. I hate God being in charge so much that I'd rather be considered an animal than I would give Him His place. That's where we are. And I just wish people would think about what they're buying into and how degrading that is. When I went to school in Birmingham years ago, 100 years ago, I took a philosophy class Philosophy 101. Had no clue what I was getting into. I was from Pleasant Grove and green as grass. And I sat down there and I heard things that I had never heard. Now, the guy who was in charge of the philosophy department at that time was James Rachels. Now, you may or may not have heard of him, but he actually became very famous in his field. James Rachels was a famous philosopher, and he was a leader among the animal rights movement. James Rachels later wrote a book called Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. And I'm not going to regale you with a lot of quotes. I'm just going to mention one quick quote from the start and the finish of this book. And I think it speaks directly to the point in Ecclesiastes 3. In the beginning of his book, early on, page 5, Mr. Rachels writes, human life, if we accept Darwinism, and that's what he says, if Darwinism is really true, we need to think about what that means. And he's a proponent of Darwinism, so he says we need to start rethinking our morality. If Darwinism is true, human life will no longer be regarded with the kind of superstitious awe which it is accorded in traditional thought. Making a human being special above an animal is a part of that old superstitious traditional thought we're getting rid of. And the lives of non-humans will no longer be a matter of indifference. This means that human life will, in a sense, be devalued, while the value granted to non-human life will be increased. A revised view of how we should treat animals will result reconstructing morality without the assumption of man's specialness. And maybe it'll take you a read or two to get through that, figure out what he's saying, but it is radical. What he's saying is if Darwin is right, then a human being is worth no more than an animal. And your child and their life is not worth any more than an animal. At the end of the book, he writes, any adequate defense of human dignity would require some conception of human beings as radically different from other animals. But that's precisely what evolutionary theory calls into question. It makes us suspicious of any doctrine that sees large gaps of any sort between humans and all other creatures. If you're a Darwinist, you should not see any major difference between humans and any other creature. Are you serious? Oh, yeah, he's deadly serious. This being so, a Darwinist or a Darwinian may conclude that a successful defense of human dignity is most unlikely. He was good friends with another fellow named Peter Singer, who shared a lot of his views. Singer was even more radical in his language. He wrote a book years ago called Practical Ethics, and in that book, he wrote, quote, human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They're not persons. And he goes on to say, if the fetus does not have the same claim to life as a person, it appears that a newborn baby does not either. And that the life of a newborn is less value than the life of a pig or a dog or a chimpanzee. This guy taught at Princeton. By the way, people who cannot wait for their kids to get to college, in my generation, that was just a part of it. If you could, not everybody did. Some smart folks chose other paths and were probably a lot smarter than we were. But, send your kids to college. Today, if you send your kids to college, they're going to run into somebody, maybe not a guy as notable as Singer. I think he may be a dead man, in fact, but maybe some disciple of his, somebody well trained by him. Man, we're sending our kids off to the firing squad. They better be ready if they're going to get in this environment. They're going to be bombarded with a lot of nonsense. And you say to yourself, well, that's outrageous. These people are crazy. Well, I understand what you're saying, but I want you to see this. Actually, what they are, they're not crazy. What they are is really consistent. Because I'll tell you something, if there is no God and we're all just crawled out of the same slime pool, what's the old saying somebody described the teaching of evolution? They said from goo to you via the zoo. I thought that's pretty good. The idea that we just all evolved through these lower processes. Well, we're just on the same path. And what Singer grasped and what Rachel's grasped is that actually, if there is no God, there's nothing special about men. What makes you special is you're made in God's image. If you take that away, if you take God's place away, you really don't have any place to hang man except just another creature. One more quote here. This actually is from my old textbook. This is what they taught me as a freshman in school. One of the essays in Moral Problems, this collection of philosophical essays edited by Rachel, included another article from Singer, in which he wrote, and I'm just taking the last part of a quote here, in which he says, nor have I considered in this essay all the detailed questions that need to be asked once we start thinking about other species in a radically different way. What, for instance, are we to do about the genuine conflicts of interest, like rats biting slum children? Do you understand? He said, what are we to do about these conflicts of interest? Rats biting slum children. The moral dilemma of trying to figure out, is the rat right on the right side of that or the child? I'm not sure the answer, he said. But the essential point is just that we do see this is a conflict of interest and that we recognize that rats have interest too. Here's what Solomon said 3,000 years ago. You take God out of the picture, and what you have left is darkness. When you take God out of His place, then you take man out of his place. And it's a disgrace and a shame that our society has said, yeah, we'll sign up for that. Don't be that foolish. To our young people, I'm just pleading with you. Don't sell your dignity and trade away the obvious fact of a creator just because you think life will be easier if you don't have to worry about being right and doing right. I like this quote from Burton Kaufman again. He writes, and I think it's a good point. Many have made this before. He writes, if our grossly wicked society really wants an explanation of the irresistible tidal wave of violent crimes which are destroying our cities and threatening the collapse of our civilization itself. This was written, by the way, about 30 years ago, not yesterday, just in case you couldn't tell. If we're looking for the answer, he says, they must find it in this very conception. The conception that there is no God and that man is merely an animal. There is only one reason why it's wrong for one man to kill another, and that reason is that every man is created in the image of God and that his destruction is against God himself. A godless society has no more rights than a society of brown rats. He was not exaggerating. He said that just about right. And we got the Smithsonian Institute and this slick multi-million-dollar display that tells a young person, you're just an animal, just maybe a little above a banana tree, but certainly no different than these primates. And then we turn around and we say, well, why are you just acting like an animal? A mystery. It's a point that Ecclesiastes, I think, helps us with. Okay, let me mention a couple of things quickly. Our time's getting away. But here's the first point. We've got to give God His place, and then we can find our place and find contentment. I think another thing that Ecclesiastes teaches that will help us to live a well-lived life, if we do believe in God, then believe Him. Have faith in Him. That passage in Ecclesiastes 3 that we have heard so often and in different contexts, we've heard these words, haven't we, repeated? To everything there is a season, a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. Let me pause there a minute. And we've wrestled with this through the years. Some of us have. What does he mean by this? And what's part of this passage? I think that one fellow put it this way, and I think he put it well. He said, this passage is not so much prescriptive as it is descriptive. And what he meant by that was, I don't think that it's proper use of this passage to try to say, now God here wants us to figure out and wake up every day. Is today the day to tear, or the day to gather, or the day? I don't think that's the point. I think it's rather descriptive. That is, what he's saying is that when you face life, you're going to find all kinds of experiences. And the whole of the flow of this passage seems to be the picture of somebody who takes one step forward and one step back. You sow and you reap. You plant, you lose. You live, you die. I think a hint of all this is found in verse 9, the next verse, when he asks, what profit hath he that works in that wherein he labors? I've seen the travail which God has given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. Well, that sounds like chapter 1, doesn't it? And I think that's no accident. I think that's exactly what he's talking about here. He had made the same point in chapter 1 and verse 3. What profit is there? What he had said previous to that is vanity of vanities, all is vanity. I think in chapter 3, Solomon, if I understand, is coming right back to this same point. He said in chapter 1, vanity of vanities, and it raises the question, where's the profit to be found? And his answer is found in looking above the sun. And in chapter 3, he talks about life in terms of gaining and losing, and all the experiences of joy and sadness. And he asked the same question. So where's the profit in all of this? This travail that God's given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. It's God that sets the seasons, and God has a purpose in allowing us to experience what we do. He's made everything beautiful in His time. He set the world or eternity in our heart. And yet we can't understand. We tried to talk about this passage this morning in verse 11. It's a great and important passage. Because I'm made in the image of God does not mean I'll ever know all God knows about this life. But he said in verse 16, even though I saw under the sun the place of judgment and wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness that iniquity was there. We live in a world filled with injustice. We live in a world that is filled with inequity. And what are we going to do about that? I'd be shocked if I'm not talking to a room full of people who hadn't wondered about that same question. What do we do about that? I tell you, there are things, if I turn on the television, I try not to do it very much. But if I turn on the television and listen for just a minute to the news, I'm just overwhelmed with frustration and sorrow. And I'm probably not alone in that. And so what are we to do with all that? Well, I think Solomon's point is found in verse 17. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work. And that's where he ties it back together. He's been talking about the times and seasons and all of that. And what does it all mean? I may never know. But what I do know is that God's above it all. It reminds me in chapter 4, he said, I returned, he begins there, and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. You know, Solomon was the king, but it didn't take him long to look around. He could see injustice in his own kingdom. I returned and saw all the oppressions done under the sun, and the tears of such that were oppressed, and they had no comfort. And on the side of their oppressors there was power. They had no comfort. He said, I tell you what, I just think that it's just better for some folks just never been born. But that's not the last word on that. I think that's the view under the sun. There's something that he said over in the 5th chapter, in verse 8, that we take heart in. Maybe I misunderstand this passage. But it seems to me this is the answer to the verse we just read. When Solomon writes now from the perspective of God and giving God His place, if thou seest oppression of the poor and violent perverting of justice, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. It's a great thing, I think. It's a great comfort to us. I'm sure that you, like me, have thought many times on that passage in 2 Peter chapter 2, where Peter talks about the judgment of God, and he recounts for us occasions when God has poured out His judgment. That was true against the angels that sinned. It was true against Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, God still took care of Lot. And God destroyed the world, but He took care of Noah. And I think that's the very point that Solomon is making here in Ecclesiastes 3, if I understand. He's saying you want to live a life that you can find some peace, then believe God. Trust Him. Realize He's in charge. And don't neglect to give Him His place. Let me mention another couple of things quickly. I'm not going to have time to talk about this third point here about taking responsibility for yourself. It's a great point, though. Over the 9th chapter, again, I think Solomon reflects a common view of life under the sun. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle of the strong, neither bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. A man also knows not his time, as the fishes are taken in an evil net, and the birds are caught in the snare, so are the sons of men snared in an evil time, which falls on them suddenly. If I understand those words, I think what Solomon is describing here is an attitude of people under the sun who make excuses. I'm not suggesting that there's no such thing as time and chance. But I do think we've all met people who are unsatisfied with where their life is, and their conclusion is they're just not lucky. I'm just not lucky. In a positive vein, I guess. But I heard one woman say one time, she said, sometimes the universe just has a plan for you. And I thought, oh my. If you're talking about providence, I believe in providence. But the universe is made out of gas and dust and rock. It doesn't have a plan for anybody. And so people that again, don't give God His place tend to blame their failures, not on disobeying God, but on the fact that they're just not lucky. And what he goes on to say is, not that sometimes innocent people can't suffer. They do. But I'll tell you, in so many cases, in my case, I'll say this. My problems are based upon the fact that I'm not very wise. And then he goes on to give illustrations in the 9th and 10th chapter about the role of wisdom. The 10th chapter begins, dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savor, so doth a little folly in them of reputation for wisdom and honor. This guy's problem is not that he wasn't lucky. His problem is that he forgot his wisdom and he fell into a little folly. That was a choice he made. And he suffered as a result of it. There's a lot of good information, I think, about that point. That our choices really determine more than the idea of luck or fortune or chance. In so many cases, our circumstances. So take responsibility for yourself. It's a great point. Let me pass on quickly to two more, then we'll close. I think generosity with others is a part of a life well lived. And Solomon speaks of that in the 11th chapter. Cast thy bread upon the waters, thou shalt find it after many days. I've listened to several smart fellows explain that passage, and I may yet not have the answer, but it's something to do with the idea, again, of casting forth and receiving back. I don't think it's the old gospel of health and wealth. You give God $20, He'll give you 40. I don't think that's the idea. But I think the idea does come down to the fact that God blesses the generous. What's that passage over in, it's Proverbs 19. I don't think we put it on the chart, but Proverbs 19, I believe it's verse 17, in which he talks about lending to the poor. Yeah, Proverbs 19:17 reads, "He that hath pity upon the poor lends unto the Lord, and that which he hath given will he pay him again." The idea is that God blesses those who are generous, and he certainly does, and he certainly has. And so he calls on us as a part of a life of reverence and purpose to look to other people. Give portion to 7, also to 8, back in our text in 11. Give portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. Most of the time I make excuses for not doing good by saying, I don't know what might happen tomorrow. The wise man says, because you don't know what might happen tomorrow, make sure you do right. Make sure you are generous. If the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth, and if a tree fall toward the south or toward the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall be. That's an interesting passage too. Maybe I don't have this in mind, but it seems to me what he's saying is that there's a contrast here between a cloud. A cloud gathers up all that moisture. It doesn't gather it up to keep it. It gathers it up to give it away. But think about that in contrast with a tree. You know, when a tree falls, you know where it's going to be? Wherever it lies. There's no more blessing coming from that. Be a blessing, and not simply one who is where he is and is never going to be anywhere else. He says, be generous. Be willing to share. Verse 4, he that observes the wind shall not sow, and he that regards the clouds shall not reap. You're not going to ever be able to get a crop if you're waiting for the perfect time. And by the way, that's a great lesson in life. It's a good lesson for me to learn. I think there are people who have good intentions, but they're waiting for the perfect time to do good. If we had time, we'd go back to that great story in Luke, the 10th chapter, of the Good Samaritan. And we've read that passage many times. And none of us ever think that this Samaritan, who was going along on that road and saw that man over there on the side of the road, was thinking to himself, wow, isn't this lucky? I have my Jew in need money right here with me, and I found one. And I have nothing to do. This is great. What timing? I don't think that's the way that happened. I don't think he expected to be dealing with that, but here's the situation, and here's the need, and here I am. And Christ would teach us through him and say, be a neighbor. I think that's what this passage is reminding us of. Be a neighbor. And as Paul will later remind us of the Lord saying, it is more blessed to give than to receive. In the morning, sow thy seed. In the evening, withhold not thy hand. For thou knowest not whether shall prosper either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good. Don't let fear hold you back from doing what's good and right. Be a blessing today. You want to be happy? Spend yourself on other people. That's a great lesson. One more that I'll share with you, and we'll say this quickly. Over in the 5th chapter of Ecclesiastes, and in verse 18 through verse 20, we find this little capsule of wisdom from Solomon. My translation reads, behold that which I have seen. It is good and comely for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he hath taken under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him. It is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joys of his heart. God gives us joy in this life to help us along. It's the gift of God. And Solomon said what you ought to do with those gifts, you ought to enjoy. Now people might say, that seems very strange. This book is so dark. Well, again, it's dark for those who only see life under the sun and who turn away from God. But actually, this message If you turn back to chapter 2, we'll not take time to read it, in verse 24, there it is again. In chapter 3, in the latter part, verse 22, there it is again. It's here in chapter 5. It's in chapter 7 in verse 13. It's in chapter 8 in verse 15. It's in chapter 9 in verse 7 beginning. Sprinkle throughout the book. You know, sometimes it's a mistake if people read Ecclesiastes and they think it's just gloom and doom and doom and gloom, and then the last 2 verses in chapter 12. That's not so. Ecclesiastes all the way through has these oases, I think of them as, where he turns away from the darkness of this world and the vanity of life without God, and he says, but now, if you give God His place, you can enjoy the blessings that He gives you. And by the way, I ought to. I don't know if anybody else needs this lesson or not, but I do. And I'm not speaking to you tonight as somebody who's got this licked yet, but I'm working on it. I figured out some time back, I live like I drive. Now, if you've ever seen me drive, I don't drive fast and I don't drive reckless. But I tell you how I drive. I drive my car looking at the road in front of me, and my mind is a million miles away. Because I'm thinking about the next thing. And I'm thinking about tomorrow, and I'm thinking about next week, and I'm thinking about what I'm supposed to be doing this time and that time. And I realized one day I live my life that way sometimes. And that's not good. It's not God's will that you do that. God gives us blessings, and we ought not feel guilty about being blessed. And we ought not feel guilty about enjoying those blessings. I can tell you something from experience. I've known people who have come through serious health crises. And, they talk about survivor's guilt. That's a real thing. I don't want you to have survivor's guilt. I don't want you, because you're healthy today and somebody else is sick, to feel like somehow you're serving God if I sit on the tack all day. That's not going to help anybody. We all take turns with those things. We're certainly mindful of those, and we ought to be there to bless our brethren. But the truth is, what we have today, what we're given today by God, is there to be enjoyed in His name. People ask, what's the difference between misery and this idea here of enjoying what you have? Recognizing that God has given. And taking that blessing and thanking God for it. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul writes as a prisoner, and he writes that I have learned in whatever state I am therewith to be content. How many folks in that prison do you think would write like that? Nobody but a Christian. But Paul could write that with all sincerity, because he says, today I'm in some measure locked away or confined, and I'll just praise God in that. And if I'm released, and I expect to be released, then I'll praise God in that. I know how to abound, and I can praise God for that. But if it all goes away, that never was my life anyway, and I'll be all right then. But don't forget to enjoy the good that God gives you. We don't get extra credit for being miserable. And I don't know if anybody else needs to hear that, but if you do, I hope we'll take that to heart. God gives you blessings to enjoy. Be generous with them. Thank God for them. But enjoy what you have. What that says to you young parents is, you're busy as you can be. You're just up to your eyeballs in work and laundry and something else. Don't forget to look those kids in the eye when they talk to you and hug them. You're smart folks. You understand how that time is that short. And they'll move off to Indiana on you. Enjoy your wife today. We got a fellow at North Bibb who lost his wife of 65 years. I went to see him yesterday. He's a grown man, and he's working on it, but it's like losing half yourself. So love folks like that have lost, and love folks like that who are struggling in some way. But if God has blessed you with a spouse, and God's blessed you with children, and God's blessed you with whatever it might be, enjoy that and glorify Him for it. And that's a part of a well-lived life. And there are other things certainly we could mention, but you've listened very patiently. Let me close with this one chart. I don't know how many of you may have seen this before. I may have shown this to some of you. This was a media campaign over in London. I think it was again our friend Richard Dawkins who was behind this media campaign promoting atheism. And on the side of buses all over London a few years ago, he had this slogan: "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." What do you do with that? Well, there are two things that occur to us immediately, two words that jump out at us. The first is the word probably. That's a significant word right there. If I told you, hey, here, drink this, it's not poison, probably. Pass. But the second word it's equally foolish here is the word enjoy. Because I think Solomon makes the point, I don't think you can enjoy your life. I don't think you can enjoy your life if you don't give God his place. You can be distracted for a while. People get drunk and they can get their belly full and they can indulge their lust here and there. But at the end of things, we don't find any happiness at all. Not really. We find guilt and shame. And if you want to find real joy, then lay your pride down and give God your life and serve him in faith and learn to love him like he loves you. Can't do better than that. Starts out by confessing Jesus as Lord, as a believer, that he is indeed the Son of God who's come to die for us, and then being baptized, buried with him in baptism, baptized for the remission of sins, raised to walk in newness of life. Maybe that's your desire tonight. We'd be glad to help you. Maybe if you're here as a child of God and not been faithful to the Lord that loves you, so why not tonight return to him? Again, we'd be glad to help you. Please let us know how we might be able to be of assistance to you. Come forward while we stand, while we sing.